Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory, and you are watching Varietal Literature, which is a YouTube page for varietal literature-literature.ca, which is a web page of Vancouver writers who just like to have fun with narrative, which includes things like which includes things like creating our own stories like we do on our own time and put up on the web page, but also on Thursdays we write stuff live. It's a little sillier in nature, but that's fun. That's 6:30 it's Thursday. That's the Varietal Show. You can see a whole playlist of it on this channel. But tonight what we're doing is we're reading Fireside Fairytales, because there's the fire and we are beside it, and we are going to read some fairy tales. And we've been reading for the last month stories from Weird Tales from Northern Seas, which is a book by Jonas Lai, who's a rather famous Norwegian author from the 19th century. And we've just been sort of picking away at stories in it because I've enjoyed them so much. And a bunch of people have been coming along, dropping comments in the chat, and we discuss the stories a bit in between them. Now, if you are new to this and you are interested in just the stories and none of me and the blabbing, check down in the description below. There will be little timestamps for where the stories start. Now, depending on how time goes today, it's never a guarantee. We'll either do 2 stories and 1 short one, or just 2 stories. So we'll see how time works out. GS, I put a question in chat because we're talking about rings today, and GS said, what is your favorite type of gold? Or sorry, I said, what is your favorite type of gold? And GS says rose gold, which is actually my favorite type of gold as well. Although I do like, what's that one that's almost silver? I can't think of what it's called, but it's a very subtle and cool kind of silvery color. It's technically a type of gold. But we are talking about rings. I don't know. I know that at least one of the rings we talk about is gold. I guess I don't. I remember the gem in the second story. I'm trying to remember what the band was made of. But both our stories regard rings. The first one is probably the most related to what is essentially a trope in folktales, which is the magical ring that breeds obsession. Now, I think most of us would know this trope. I mean, obviously, I made reference to the most famous version of it, which is Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings uses the gold ring. It changes shape to fit the finger that it wants to be worn. It has magical abilities without getting lost in lore. Obviously, the most famous ability it has is it takes a person to this sort of nether realm, this ethereal realm, and makes them invisible in the world. But actually, the powers of the One Ring, which is what it's called in the book, vary based on who they're with. And it's really kind of unique to hobbits to make them invisible. Others, it seems to just make them powerful in some respect. So, that's an example of in modern literature of the continuation of the trope of magical rings that breed obsession and have kind of darkness to them, or at least lead a person to do foolish things or whatever else. But it is a trope. It's a trope that goes back to at least ancient Greece. There's a tale that I've completely forgotten the name of right now, but there is a tale of a ring making somebody invisible. It's a moral equation. It's a moral mind experiment by a philosopher about, what would keep you being ethical if you could make yourself invisible and do whatever you want and never be held accountable for it. But it is told in the form of a fable or a tale with a ring that makes you invisible. And Nordic literature that we've seen before, actually, has absolute tropes of rings with obsessive qualities that they bring out in the people that have worn them. And I think our first story, The Earth Draws, Jonas Lai, good writer, not always the best at names, but The Earth Draws is the first story that we'll read, really has a lot of like shades of Gollum into it. And I want to be clear, it's pre-Tolkien. This is 19th century stories. This is not in any way inspired by Lord of the Rings. Quite the contrary at best. So we're just going to kind of see versions of that. And how they just always tend, that trick, that hook of like a ring that creates obsession, always tends to make a good story. Gia says platinum. Is platinum a type of gold? I thought platinum was its own metal alloy. Or even just its own metal. Because I'm thinking of a type of gold that looks, to my eye anyways, quite silver. But I do like platinum, that's true. So we're going to read a story called The Earth Draws. It's the longer of our two stories we're definitely reading. That is about a mysterious ring and its mysterious abilities and obsession. But I'm also going to read a story a little later that's a little less dark in the same way and more about love and rings. And yeah, if we have time, the last one has nothing to do with either of our themes of rings and obsession. It's just a very short, creepy little tale about Draugr, which is, or Draug, which is the undead at sea in the Norwegian traditions. There's white gold, that's what it is. White gold is what I'm thinking of. Okay, so that's just an introduction of our theme. This first story is called The Earth Draws, from Weird Tales from Northern Seas by Jonas Lai. There was once a young salesman at the storekeepers at Sorvag. He was fair with curly hair, shrewd blue eyes, and so smart and obliging and handsome that all the girls in town got themselves sent on errands and made pilgrimages to the shop on purpose to see him. Moreover, he was so smart and skillful in everything he put his hand to that the storekeeper never would part with him. Now it happened one day he went out to a fishing station for his principal. The current was dead against him, so he rowed close inshore. All at once he saw a little ring in the rocky wall above the high water mark. He thought it was the sort of ring which is used for fastening boats to, so he fancied it wouldn't do any harm to rest a bit and lay to shore, and have a snack of something, for he'd been pulling at the oars from early morn. But when he took hold of the ring to run his boat line through it, it fitted round his finger so tightly that he had to tug at it. He tugged, and out of the mountain side with a rush came a large drawer. It was brimful of silk neckerchiefs and woman's frippery. He was amazed and began pondering the matter over. Then he saw what looked like rusty flakes of iron in rows right over the whole mountainside, exactly resembling the slit of his own drawer. He had now got the ring on his finger, and must needs try it if it would open the other slits also. And out he drew the drawer after drawer full of gold bracelets and silver bracelets, glass pearls, brooches and rings, bracelets and laced caps, yarn, nightcaps and woolen drawers, coffee, sugar, groats, tobacco pipes, buttons, hooks and eyes, knives, axes, and scythes. He drew out drawer after drawer. There was no end to the display they made. But all around him he heard, as it were, the humming of a crowd and the tramp of sea boots. There was a hubbub as if there were rolling hogsheads over a bridge and hoisting sails against the wind. And out from the sea sounded the stroke of oars and the bumping of boats putting ashore. Then he began to have an inkling that he'd laid to his boat at a mooring ring belonging to the underground folk. Kind of, by the way, just as a description, underground folk is kind of like what we would think of as dwarves. It's not really, but I think that's probably the closest. And had lit right upon their landing place where they deposited their wares. He stood there looking into a drawer of meerschaum, pipes, and they were finer than any he had thought it possible to find in the whole world. Then he felt, as it were, the blow of a heavy hand which tried to thrust him aside, but at the same time someone laughed so merrily close by. The same instant he saw a young woman in the forepart of his boat. She was leaning, with broad shoulders and hairy arms, over a meal sack. Her eyes laughed and shot forth sparks as from a smithy in the dark, but her face was oddly pale. Then she vanished altogether like a vision. He was glad when he got down into his boat again and pushed off and rowed away. But when he got out into the Sound and slackened speed a bit, he perceived that the ring still sat upon his finger. His first thought was to tear it off, fling it into the sea, but then it sat tighter than ever. It was so curiously wrought and fretted and engraved that he must needs examine it more curiously, and the longer he looked at it, the stranger the gold whereof it was wrought gleamed and glistened. Turn it as he would to examine its spirals, he could never make out where they began and where they ended. But as he sat there and looked at it, the black crackling and sparkling eyes of that pale face stood out more and more plainly before his eyes. He didn't exactly know whether he thought her ugly or handsome, the uncanny creature. The ring he now meant to keep, come what might. And home he rode and said not a word to anybody of what had happened to him. But from that day forth a strange restlessness came over him. When he was sweeping out the shop or measuring goods, he would suddenly stand there in a brown study and fancy he was right away at the landing stage in the mountainside, and the black woman was laughing at him over the meal sack. Out yonder he must needs venture once more and put his ring to the test, though it cost him his life. And in course of the summer his boat lay over at the mountainside in the selfsame place as before. When he'd opened the drawer with his gold ring, he caught sight of the broad-shouldered woman. Her eyes sparkled and had a wild look about them, and she peered curiously at him. And every time he came, he seemed to be more expected, and she was more and more gladsome. They became quite old acquaintances, and she was always waiting for him there. But at home he grew gloomy and silent, yet although he bethought him that it was all sorcery, and her arms were hairy almost like a beast's, and although he determined and really tried to keep away, nevertheless he could not help going thither, and whenever he'd been away from her a whole week, she grew quite unmanageable, and laughed and shrieked when she saw him coming again. And he always heard the noise and the bustle of many people all about him, but never could he see anything. It seemed to him, however, as if they all lay a little way off and pulled their boat aside for him to pass. His boat, too, was always nicely bailed out, the oars and sails righted and trimmed. The cable, too, was fastened for him whenever he came and thrown to him wherever he went away. Now and then she so managed it that she caught a glimpse into their warehouses and their bright halls in the mountainside. At such times she seemed to be enticing him after her, and then, on his way home, he would shudder. What, thought he, if the mountain wall were to shut behind me? And every time he was right glad he'd been so far on his guard and had come off scot-free. And now, towards autumn, he grew more at his ease. He really made up his mind to try and give up these journeys. He set to work in real earnest, so that he had no time for thought, and plunged into his business with fiery impetuousness is more what I would say, to be honest. When Christmastide drew nigh, with its snowflake and darkness, such strange fancies came over him. Whenever he went into the dark, draughty nooks and corners, he saw the strong, heavily built shape before him. She laughed and called to him, and shrieked, and sent him messages by the blast. And then a strong desire came upon him, and one day he was unable to hold out any longer, so off he went. He fancied he caught a glimpse of her a long way off. She was casting huge boulders aside so as to see and follow the course of the boat, and she beckoned and greeted him through the drizzle and the mist. It was as though the current was bearing him thither all the time. When he came, the sea seethed and boiled for the crowds that were in it, though he saw them not. They waded out to him and drew his boat ashore, and steps and a bridge lay there ready for his feet. But right at the top stood she, and her breath came heavily. And she leaned towards him and drew him with those bold eyes of hers set in that face as pale as night. She went swiftly inland and looked behind her and beckoned him after her, and then she threw open the door of an old iron safe in the midst of the wall. On its shelves sparkled a bridal crown and a shining girdle and breastplate and a kirtle and all manner of bridal finery. There she stood, and her breath came straining hot and heavy through her white teeth, and she smiled and ogled him artfully. He felt her take a hold of him, and it was as though a darkness fell around him. Then all at once, as if in a gleam of twilight, he saw the whole trading place, vast and wealthy and splendid, all round about him with its haven, warehouses, and trading ships. She stretched out her hands and pointed to it as if she would say that he should be the lord and master of the whole of it. A cold shiver ran through him. He perceived that it led right into the mountain. And out he rushed. He cut the cable through with his knife and wrenched the ring from his finger and cast it into the sea, and off he rode, so that the sea was like a foaming fosse around him. And when he got home to his work again, the bustle of the Christmas season began. He felt as if he had awakened from a heavy nightmare or an evil dream. He felt so light of heart. He chatted gaily with customers over the counter, and his old life went on much the same as before. And everything he put his hand to went along smooth as butter. But the tradesman's daughters stuck her head into the shop, not once nor twice. She looked and smiled at him in shy admiration. Never had he remarked before what taking ways were hers, or noticed how bonny and bright the lass was, and how graceful and supple she looked as she stood in the doorway. And ever since the tradesman's daughter had looked so strangely at him, he had no thought for anyone but her. He was always thinking what a way she had of holding her head, or how slim she looked when she walked about. And what quick and lively blue eyes she had, just like merry twinkling stars. He would lay awake o' nights and reflect upon his grievous, abominable sin in lowering himself to the level of an uncanny monster, and right glad was he that he'd cast the ring away. But on Christmas Eve, when the shop was shut and the house folks and servants were making ready for the festival in kitchen and parlor, the shopkeeper took him aside into his counting house. If he liked his daughter, said he, there was no impediment that he could see. Let him take heart and woo her, for it hadn't escaped him how she was moping about all lovesick on his account. He himself, said the shopkeeper, was old and would like to retire from the business. The good-looking shopman did not wait to be asked twice. He wooed straight away, and before the Christmas cheer was on the table, he got yes for an answer. Then years and years passed over them, and they thrived and prospered in house and home. They had pretty and clever children. He rejoiced in his wife. Nothing was good enough for her, and honor and ease were her portion, both at home and abroad. But in the 7th year, when it was drawing towards Yuletide, such strange restlessness came over him. He wandered about all by himself, and he could find peace nowhere. His wife fretted and sorrowed over it. She knew not what it could be, and it seemed to her that he oddly avoided her. He would wander for hours together about the dark pack-house loft, among coffers and casks and barrels and sacks, and it was as though he didn't like folks to come thither when he was there. Now, it chanced on the day before Little Christmas Eve that one of the workpeople had to fetch something from the loft. There stood the master, deep in thought, by one of the meal sacks, staring down on the ground before him. "Don't you see the iron ring down in the floor there?" he asked. But the man saw no ring. "I see it there. The earth draws," he sighed heavily. On Little Christmas Eve he was nowhere to be found, nor on the day after, though they searched for him high and low and made inquiries about him everywhere amidst the Yuletide bustle and merriment. But late on Christmas Eve, while they were all running about in the utmost anxiety, not knowing whether they should lay the table or not, all at once in he came through the door. He longed so much for both meat and drink, he said. He was so happy and merry and jovial the whole evening through that they all clean forgot the fright they had been in. For a whole year afterwards, he was chatty and sociable as before, and he made so much of his wife that it was quite absurd. He bore her in his hands, so to speak, and absolutely could not do enough for her. But when it drew towards Yuletide again, and the darkest time of year, the same sort of restlessness came over him. It was as though they only saw his shadow amongst them, and he went moping about the pack-house loft again, and lingering there. On Little Christmas Eve, the same thing happened as before. He disappeared. His wife and the people of the house went about in a terrible way, and were filled with astonishment and alarm. And on Christmas Eve, he suddenly stepped into the room again and was merry and jovial as he generally was. But when the lights had burnt out and they'd all gone to bed, his wife could hold her tongue no longer. She burst into tears and begged him to tell her where he'd been. Then he thrust her roughly from him, and his eyes shot sparks as if he were downright crazy. He implored her, for their mutual happiness' sake, never to ask him such a question again. Time went on, and the same thing happened every year. When the days grew dark, he moped about by himself, all gloomy and silent, and seemed bent upon hiding himself away from people. And on Little Christmas Eve, he always disappeared, though nobody ever saw him go. And punctually on Christmas Eve, at the very moment when they were about to lay the table, he all at once came in the door, happy and contented with them all. Just before every autumn, toward the dark days, always earlier than the year before, the restlessness came over him, and he moped about with it, moodier and shyer of people than ever. His wife never again questioned him, but a load of sorrow lay upon her, and it seemed to her to grow heavier and more crushing, since she seemed no longer to be able to take care of him, and he no longer seemed to belong to her. Now, one year, when it was again drawing nigh to Yuletide, he began roaming about as usual, heavy and cast down. And the day before Little Christmas Eve, he took his wife along with him into the pack-house loft. "Do you see anything there? By the meal sack?" he asked. But she saw nothing. Then he gripped her by the hand and begged and implored her to remain and go with him there that night, as if his life was dear to him, said he, and he would fain to try and stay at home that day. In the course of the night he tightly grasped her hand time after time and sighed and groaned, and she felt that he was holding on to her and striving hard and with all his might against something. When morning came, it was all over. He was happier and lighter of mood than she had seen him for a long, long time, and he remained at home. On that Christmas Eve, there was such a hauling and a carrying upstairs from both shop and cellar, and the candles shone till all the window panes sparkled again. It was the first real festival he had ever spent in his own house, he said, and he meant to make a regular banquet of it. But when, as the custom was, people of the house came in one by one and drank the healths of their master and mistress, he grew paler and paler and whiter, as if his blood were being sucked out of him and drained away. "The earth draws!" he shrieked, and there was a look of horror in his eyes, and immediately afterwards he sat there dead. The end. GS says, "This is so tragic." Sure is. It was not a cheerful story exactly, but it was a devilishly interesting one to me. Now we'll go on to the second story, which is actually the next story in the line here, the Cormorants of Andvær, but which is also kind of a tragic story, to be honest. But here's a couple of things that I like about it. First of all, it's very like grown up in feel, but if you pay attention to its structure, it is actually still a fairy tale. It has all the same conventions. It has the repeats, the cycle of the fairy tale. Like fairy tales have cycles, you know, like an example of like a cycle in a fairy tale would be the Three Little Pigs. You know, they have the repeat dialogue, and each time the cycle's a little bit different. You know, blow your house down, and then, you know, they do, and he runs to the next one, and they say the same thing, and he blows it down, and then the last one is where the conclusion is. Those little cycles are very folktale, very fairy tale kind of formats, and that's here. The cycle is, you know, how he calls the first time he goes and disappears in the storehouse and disappears for a day. This next time, the help, he asks them this weird question about the ring on the floor, and the third time he brings his wife in. She gets him through the day without him going back there, and then you reach the conclusion, which that killed him. The other thing that I like about it, other than the fact that it's basically a grown-up fairy tale structure, but a grown-up story, is how metaphorical it is. The truth is, it's a very interesting writing choice that we follow him the first time, but get no real answers on what's going on, and we never follow him again. We don't know if he sees the same thing every time. We don't know why he goes back. We don't get what cheers him up. You know, is it about addiction? Is it about depression? I mean, the seasonal thing seems to indicate it might be something like that. Why does he die? You know, why does ultimately rejecting this mountain person die? Who is she? She is described as like pale, but bestial. So like, you know, is she a spirit of death or something? Is she offering him a place on her throne? Who knows? GS says his past. Yeah, exactly. Like it could be a past, just anything that kind of haunts that you can't get away from. And in that lack of detail, in not being precise or heavy-handed about what exactly it is that draws him out over the sea, it leaves us enough space to find ourselves in it, to put it poetically. So the next story is called The Cormorants of Andvær, and it is also from Weird Tales from the Northern Sea by Jonas Lai, and there is a very lovely picture that is relevant to the story. Allow me to size it up so that we can get a good look at it. There's the cormorants flying away, and the man looking distressed. This is The Cormorants of Andvær from Weird Tales from the Northern Sea by Jonas Lai. Outside Andvær lies an island, the haunt of wild birds, which no man can land upon, be the sea never so quiet. The sea swells and girds it around about with suckling whirlpools and dashing breakers. On fine summer days, something sparkles there from the sea foam like a large gold ring, and time out of mind, folks have fancied there was a treasure there left by some pirates of old. At sunset, sometimes, there looms forth from thence a vessel with a castle astern, and a glimpse is caught now and then of an old-fashioned galley. There it lies as if in a tempest, carves its way along through the heavy white rollers. Along the rocks sit the cormorants in a long black row, lying in wait for dogfish. But there was a time when one knew the exact number of the birds. There was never more nor less of them than 12 well upon a stone, and out in the sea mist sat the 13th. But it was only visible when it rose and flew right over the island. The only persons who lived near Var at winter time, long after the fishing season was over, was a woman and a slip of a girl. Their business was to guard the scaffolding poles for drying fish against the birds of prey, who had such a villainous trick of hacking at the drying ropes. The young girl had thick, coal-black hair and a pair of eyes that peeped at folks so oddly. One might almost have said that she was like the cormorants outside there, and she had never seen so much else all her life. Nobody knew who her father was. Thus they lived till the girl had grown up. It was found that in the summertime, when the fishermen went out to the Var to fetch away dried fish, that the young fellows began underbidding each other so as to be selected for that special errand. Some gave up their share of the profits and others their wages, and there was a general complaint in all the villages round about that, on such occasions, no end of betrothals were broken off. But the cause of it all was the girl out yonder, with the odd eyes. For all her rough and ready ways, she had something about her. Said those she chatted with that there was no resisting. She turned the heads of all the young fellows, and it seemed as if they couldn't live without her. The first winter, a lad wooed her, who had both house and warehouse of his own. "If you come again in the summertime, and give me the right gold ring, I will be wedded by. Something may come of it," said she. And sure enough, in the summertime, the lad was there again. He had a lot of fish to fetch away, and she might have had a gold ring as heavy and as bonny as her heart could wish for. "The ring I must have lies beneath the wreckage in the iron chest over at the island yonder," said she. "That is, if you love me enough to dare fetch it." But then the lad grew pale. He saw the sea boar rise and fall out of there like a white wall of foam on the bright summer day, and on the island sat the cormorant sleeping in the sunshine. "And dearly do I love thee," said he, "but such a quest as that would mean my burial, not my bridal." In the same instant, the 13th cormorant rose from his stone in the misty foam and flew right over the island. Next winter, the steersman of a yacht came a-wooing. For 2 years he gone about and hugged his misery for her sake, and he got the same answer. "If you come again in the summertime, and give me the right gold ring, I'll be wedded with. Something may come of it." Out to the Var he came again on Midsummer Day, but when he heard where the gold ring lay, he sat and wept the whole day till evening, when the sun began to dance northwestward into the sea. Then the 13th cormorant rose and flew right over the island. There was nasty weather during the 3rd winter. There were manifold wrecks, and on the keel of a boat which came driving ashore hung an exhausted young lad hung by his knife belt. But they couldn't get the life back into him, roll and rub him about in the boathouse as they might. They didn't know CPR back then. Then the girl came in. "'Tis my bridegroom," said she, and she laid him in her bosom, and sat with him the whole night through, and put warmth into his heart. And when the morning came, his heart beat. "Methought I lay betwixt the wings of a cormorant. I leaned my head against its downy breast," said he. The lad was ruddy and handsome, with curly hair, but he couldn't take his eyes away from the girl. He took work upon the var, but off he must needs be gadding and chatting with her, be it never so early and never so late. So it fared with him as it had fared with the others. It seemed to him that he could not live without her, and on the day when he was bound to depart, he wooed her. "Thee I will not fool," said she. "Thou hast laid on my breast, and I would give my life to save thee from sorrow. Thou shalt have me if thou wilt place the betrothal ring upon my finger, but longer than the day lasts thou canst not keep me. And now I will wait and long after thee with a horrible longing till the summer comes." On Midsummer Day the youth came thither on his boat all alone. And there she told him of the ring that he must fetch from her among the skerries. "If thou hast taken me off the keel of the boat, thou mayst cast me forth yonder again," said the lad. "Live without thee I cannot." But as he laid hold of the oars in order to row out, she stepped into the boat with him and sat in the stern. Wondrous fair was she. It was beautiful summer weather, and there was a swell upon the sea. Wave followed upon wave and long, bright rollers. The lad sat there, lost in the sight of her. He rowed and rowed till the in-sucking breakers roared and thundered among the skerries. The groundswell was strong, and the frothing foam spurted up as high as towers. "If thy life is dear to thee, turn back now." "Thou art dearer to me than life itself," he made answer. But just as it seemed to the lad as if the prow were going under, and the jaws of death were gaping wide before him, it grew all at once as still as a calm, and the boat could run ashore as if there was never a billow there. On the island lay a rusty old ship's anchor half out to the sea. "In the iron chest which lies beneath the anchor is my dowry," said she. "Carry it up into thy boat, and put the ring that thou seest on my finger. With this thou dost make me thy bride. So now I am thine, till the sun dances northwestwards into the sea." It was a gold ring, with a red stone in it. He put it on her finger and kissed her. In a cleft on the skerry was a patch of green grass. There they sat them down, and they were ministered to in wondrous wise. How he knew not nor cared to know, so great was his joy. "Midsummer Day is beauteous," said she, "and I am young, and thou art my bridegroom. And now we'll to our bridal bed." So bonny was she that he could not contain himself for love. But when night drew nigh, and the sun began to dance out into the sea, she kissed him and shed tears. "Beauticious is the summer day," said she, "and still more beauticious is the summer evening. But now the dusk cometh." And all at once it seemed to him as if she were becoming older and fading right away. When the sun went below the sea margin, there lay before him on the skerry some mouldering linen rags and naught else. Calm was the sea, and in the clear midsummer night there flew 12 cormorants out over the sea. GS says, beautiful writing. Yeah, man, it's gorgeous writing. That's the thing. Like, I don't even know if people want to hear more stories from this book, and I don't care because it's great writing. Even if not all the stories are amazing, which I think most of them have been pretty good, but even if they weren't, the prose alone. I particularly like the line. So now I am thine till the sun dances northwestwards into the sea. Again, a very kind of metaphorical myth. And a really beautiful one at that. One I won't ruin by piecing apart too much. Alright. We have enough time for our last story. It's a very short one. It's only a couple of pages. This one, no great tragic romance, no rings, no obsession, just a creepy story. That's all. But I liked it, and I didn't know where else to fit it. This one's called Tug of War. Get one more drink of water. We'll read our last story, and then we'll call it a night. Gia says, nice cello. Yeah, actually, this is one of my favorite songs on the list. Unfortunately, cello does kind of compete with my range of voice because I am a bass baritone voice, and it is a bass baritone instrument, so I can't put too much cello on here, but I do really like cello. This story is called Tug of War. It's from Weird Tales from the Northern Sea by Jonas Lai. For the last 2 or 3 days, the weather had been terrific. But on the third day, it so far cleared up that one of the men who belonged to the fishing station thought that he might manage to drag the nets a bit that day. Fish, in other words. The others, however, were not inclined to venture out. Now, it is the custom for the various crews to lend each other a hand in pushing off the boats, and so it happened now. When, however, they came to the Fembering, which is as we've established in previous weeks, a large boat in the Norwegian seas in the 19th century, which was drawn up a good distance ashore. They found the oars and thwarts turned upside down in the boat, and more than that, despite all their exertions, it was impossible to move the boat from the spot. They tried once, twice, thrice, but it was of no use. Then one of them, who was known to have second sight, said that from what he saw, it would be best not to touch the boat all that day. It was too heavy for the might of man to move. Second sight, as I best understand it, means that he either is prophetic or can see spirit realm stuff. Don't take my word for that, though. It's a hard thing to find information on. It's so vague. One of the crew, however, who belonged to the fishing station, he was a smart lad of 14, was amusing them all the time with all manner of pranks and tomfoolery. He now caught up a heavy stone and pitched it with all his might right into the stern of the boat. Then suddenly, and plainly visible to them all, out of the boat rushed a drog in seaman's clothes, but with a heavy crop of seaweed instead of a head. It had been weighing down the boat by sitting in the stern, and now dashed into the sea so that the foam spurted all over them. After that, the Fembering glided out quite smoothly into the water, and then the man with the second sight looked at the boy and said that he should not have done so. But the lad went on laughing as before and said he didn't believe in such stuff. When they'd come home in the evening and the folks lay sleeping in the fishing station, they heard, about 12 o'clock at night, the lad yelling for help. It even seemed to one of them by the light of the train oil lamp as if a heavy hand were stretching forward from the door right up to the bench where the lad lay. The lad, yelling and struggling, had already been dragged as far as the door before the others had so far come to their senses as to think of grasping him around the body to prevent him from being dragged right out. And now, in mid-doorway, a hard fight began, the drogger dragging him by the legs, while the whole crew tugged against him with the boy's arms and upper limbs. Thus, amidst yelling and groaning, they swayed to and fro all through the midnight hour, backwards and forward in the half-open door, and now the drog, and now the men, had most of the boy on their side of the doorway. And then all at once, the drog let go, and so that the whole crew fell higgledy-piggledy backwards onto the floor. And then they found that the boy was dead. It was only then that the drog had let him go. GS says, I do love drog stories. Oh, that's cool. I like them because, like, they're kind of zombie-ish, but they're very, like, nefarious. You know, I guess what I like about it is I can understand the instinct of if you had this terrible death at sea and then you didn't get to die, of just being bitter at the living and doing terrible things to them because you can. I guess it makes sense to me. GS says, ew. Yeah, I do like that it's kind of left implied there, but it's pretty clear what happens. All right. Wow, we got through 3 stories and it's not even an hour. Not short stories either. GS says, yes, because I don't like zombies normally. Yeah, because I feel like, okay, I feel like zombie stories have their place, but they're usually the exact same message every single time. They're kind of dull. Like, I mean, at most they say like they're zombies but they move fast now, but it's always kind of the same thing. It's like, are we the real zombies, and who's the real monster, the zombies or man? Like, it's always something on, it's some riff on like consumerism or something. And it's cool when it came out, and like the first 100 versions of it were pretty interesting, but at this point it's an exhausted metaphor. I haven't really seen anything particularly original since, I guess, Shaun of the Dead was the last one, and even then it didn't have that much more to say. It just was a fun movie. But the Drog are interesting because they're sort of menacing spirits. They have plans and they do mean things, and they were us. They're not just spirits of like of an imperceptible nature. They are the drowned, and they're full of like anger that they take out in this sort of tenacious, almost poltergeist way. And yeah, they're creepy. I mean, yeah, they've come up a lot in modern video games, actually. The Witcher 3, the Wild Hunt game for PlayStation and, well, everything, which is based on the Witcher books, has Draugr, and those are the ones that honestly I picture when I think of this. Now, the story on what Draugr are in The Witcher is very different. The Witcher is actually really technically a sci-fi show, even though in no way it looks that way. And all the mythical creatures, which people believe are the drowned coming back to life, are actually aliens from other universes that fell through a portal thing that happened several hundred years prior to the events of The Witcher. So they're technically aliens, but they are based around, they're called Draugr, and they're based around the Drog or the Draugr, Draugr being Icelandic and Drog being Norway and other areas around Norway, of the drowned dead coming back to life and being menaces. The other one that probably more recently had Draugr is God of War, the reboot God of War, which is set in Nordic myth, or Norse myth rather, and they are the main kind of fodder bad guys, but those ones are basically zombies. In both cases, they're kind of just zombies in the game, which I feel like is a misinterpretation. I think they're a lot more conscious, and you know what they remind me actually of is they remind me of the Pirates of the Caribbean boats of the dead. Apparently, we've seen this in some of the stories, but apparently they ride around on half boats, just the keel. Anyways, yeah, we got through our 3 stories. We got through what I think, well, my personal favorite, which was see, this is why the title is bad. It's forgettable. The Earth Draws, I think is what it's called. And then, which was our longest one. And then if you missed it, by the way, you can jump right back, or within an hour of the video. I mean, you can immediately replay the video, but within an hour of the video, I can give you timestamps down in the description below, and you can jump to those stories to read them, or hear them read them. The second one was the Cormorants of Andvær, I think it was. And that was a very sort of tragic love story that I really liked. And then this silly, creepy little fireside one to end your Tug of War. So yeah, go back and watch it if you missed it. Some good stories tonight. All from Weird Tales from the Northern Sea by Jonas Lai, a 19th century Norwegian writer, in a book that I have greatly enjoyed. All right. That's enough of me and my babbling. Thank you so much to GS for keeping me company in the chat. If you haven't already, give the video a like. It helps a lot. Beyond that, I will keep the fire warm for you. Hopefully you get a good sleep. Thank you so much, and enjoy your night.